Sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny are a lesbian's best friend, at least in the countries we will cover today. Now, of course, this is a sick and not particularly funny joke, but it does touch on a fascinating phenomenon in which being a gay man is a harshly punished criminal offense, while being a lesbian is legally fine. But before we jump into the countries where this is the case, it is important to highlight that these laws are not pro-woman or pro-lesbian, but are rather based in such extreme levels of misogyny that men who created and passed them refused to even accept that women were capable of having sexual desire or deriving sexual pleasure. As you will soon see, the vast majority of laws we will explore today were passed at a time when women could not vote, could not own property, and could literally be beat by their fathers and husbands if they stepped out of line. In this environment, most doctors, religious leaders, and politicians refused to even consider the fact that women could be motivated by desire, and certainly not by desire for another woman. Of course, the concept of lesbians existed, but it was almost treated as a conspiracy theory or a joke rather than a legitimate sexual orientation. As such, leaving women out of bans on homosexuality was about keeping all women othered and categorized as passive and incapable of pursuing romantic and sexual relationships outside the bounds of marriage. So, while it may feel natural to joke about how lesbians have it better in these countries, the reality on the ground is far darker than what the laws may suggest, as they are often still pressured by their families into marriage with a man, marriages that in these same countries often result in domestic violence. And so, with this very important context covered, let's now take some time to explore which parts of the world explicitly criminalize gay men, but not gay women. We will split them into 4 major sections based off of how their laws came to be, including British colonial laws, USSR-imposed laws, self-inflicted laws, and then ending with other miscellaneous colonial laws. To begin, our journey starts in the Caribbean with Jamaica and the Offenses Against the Person Act of 1864. Under this law, men in Jamaica are sentenced to up to 10 years in prison, where lesbians are mostly ignored by the law, as it does not explicitly address them. Currently, there are no anti-discrimination laws in areas like housing, healthcare, or employment, nor are there any hate crime protections. And as such, being openly lesbian is still incredibly dangerous, and instances of police brutality and domestic violence against gay women is widespread. Also, due to this lack of legal protections, justice for victims is exceedingly rare. Moving across the Atlantic to Africa now, we find Sierra Leone, and the Offenses Against the Person Act of 1861, a precursor piece of legislation to the one that we see in Jamaica, which was from 1864. And not only is there a visible lack of anti-discrimination laws in Sierra Leone as well, but a 2023 poll from Afrobarometer found that less than 6% of respondents from Sierra Leone would tolerate having a homosexual neighbor. And the country is currently ranked 160th in the world for LGBTQ rights, with one of the lowest public opinion scores on Earth. So, while being a lesbian is not a crime in Sierra Leone, I still would not recommend the country as your next sapphic vacation. Staying in Africa, but moving to the southern half of the continent, we now arrive in Zimbabwe. Since 1891, it has been a crime to be a gay man, and punishments can include a fine and up to 10 years in prison. It is reported by local activists that this law was rarely enforced up until 1995, when President at the time, Robert Mugabe, began strictly applying the law and targeting LGBTQ people across the country, a persecution that continues to this day. According to a 2022 poll from the World Values Survey, only 5.84% of respondents from Zimbabwe believed that homosexuality was justifiable. And in Zimbabwe, trans people are considered by the government to be homosexuals and treated the same by law enforcement. While lesbians are not explicitly criminalized under the 1891 law, lesbians are still targeted in their communities and face extreme levels of violence for their sexual orientation. To the next stop on this journey today, we are taken all the way to the Pacific Ocean, where we eventually arrive in Kiribati. Ever since 1892, gay men who were caught in a relationship have been sentenced to 14 years in prison, while homosexual women are not addressed under the colonial-era law. This island nation of just 135,000 does not have reliable polling data for LGBTQ acceptance, but we do know that the rates of gender-based violence against women is some of the highest in the world, and lesbians often face even higher levels than the overall average. There are efforts to change things for the better in Kiribati, and in recent years the government has been less inclined to enforce its laws against gay men. But for now, the country remains incredibly dangerous for our entire community, and like every country on this list today, is best avoided unless for activism-related purposes. But now, we need to go halfway around the world until we arrive in South America and find Guyana, the only country on the continent that still criminalizes male homosexuality under its 1893 Colonial Criminal Code. But in practice, this law has been used to target the entire community for the past century and a half. Now, I will mention that technically, the law is only anti-booty play, so it could be argued that deep-throating, like this jaundiced piggy allegedly did with President Clinton, should be totally fine. Hey Siri, can you play Throat Goat by Kim Petras? Donikov Rampinski aside, the sad truth is that even LGBTQ people who are not in relationships are still at risk, as there are no hate crime protections or comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in place. And this has made the country dangerous for lesbians and trans people in particular, despite not being officially criminalized themselves. But public opinion is shifting in our favor. No gay men have been jailed in years, and 5 out of the 6 major political parties in the country have recently come together to commit to overturning the colonial-era anti-gay law. So, while Guyana remains one of the worst places in the Western Hemisphere for our community, things are starting to look up, and this is genuine reason to be cautiously optimistic. But now we move away from the countries that inherited their horrendous anti-gay laws from the UK to 2 countries that inherited theirs from the USSR, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. After the collapse of the USSR, each newly formed country had the opportunity to decide which laws it wanted to keep and which it wanted to change. Male homosexuality was forbidden under Soviet rule, and men convicted of being gay were sentenced to up to 5 years in prison across the bloc. But after the USSR collapsed, every country other than Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan reversed the Soviet policy. Upon gaining independence, both countries doubled down on primitive-minded hatred and codified their own, similar new laws based off the USSR model. Uzbekistan's law sends gay men to prison for 3 years, and Turkmenistan's law for 2 years. In both countries, lesbians are technically not criminals, and yet these societies are immensely hostile to all LGBTQ people and deeply misogynistic. Combined, this means that gay women often suffer worse abuse than prison, just by existing. Sadly, there is no indication at this time that the situation is even improving, and little public opinion polling has taken place in either country for LGBTQ rights in years, with one of the most recent polls from the 2014 World Values Survey in Uzbekistan finding that only 1.33% of respondents thought homosexuality was ever justifiable. And now, in 2025, life has become nearly impossible for all members of our community. In these 2 countries, the situation only appears to be worsening, especially due to countries like Russia encouraging further crackdowns on LGBTQ people across their sphere of influence. And the US and Europe remain silent as usual, so fleeing these countries is quite literally the only option that most queer people have there to live an open and authentic life in safety. We have now covered countries that have criminalized gay men, in large part because of British and Soviet colonial oppression, but now we need to discuss a handful of countries that essentially embraced barbaric levels of bigotry all on their own. The first of which being Lebanon. Now, Lebanon was under French rule, but some forget that neither France nor any of its colonies ever criminalized homosexuality. But in the exact year that Lebanon gained independence, its own government chose to introduce a law criminalizing gay men. Article 534 of the Lebanese Penal Code makes homosexuality between men a crime, and this law has been used to justify attacks on our community ever since. A 2022 poll from the World Values Survey found that only 2.67% of Lebanese people believed that homosexuality was ever justifiable, and the country is currently ranked 156th in the world for LGBTQ rights in 2025. In Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon, there have been campaigns and protests that have called for homosexuality to be legalized, but each of these have been shut down, often violently, by law enforcement. Furthermore, in the Hezbollah-controlled parts of the country, homosexuality is punished with death, and the recently exterminated leader spent immense amounts of his time calling for the mass killing of queer people across the country. So, there is certainly a huge divide between the north and south of Lebanon, but even in Beirut, living life as an openly LGBTQ person is nearly impossible, as the government has vowed to keep targeting and shutting down organizations advocating for queer rights, and continue to find and remove venues and bars that cater to our community. So, while on paper lesbians are not explicitly criminalized, the extreme censorship of LGBTQ discussion and content, combined with a very religious and patriarchal society, leads to an environment where lesbians and trans people are nearly as persecuted as homosexual men, and in some cases may even face more gender-based domestic abuse and police brutality. Heading back now to the Caribbean, we find a country that has actually been evolving backwards and re-criminalized male homosexuality after having previously decriminalized it for 7 years between 2018 and 2025. Trinidad and Tobago gained its full independence back in 1962, and finally, half a century later, scrapped the colonial-era anti-gay law, only to then reintroduce their own version of it. I actually made an entire video dedicated to the collapse of LGBTQ rights in this highly religious and socially backwards country, so I recommend checking that out for a deeper dive. But the main takeaway for now is that gay men are sentenced to 5 years in prison if caught, and lesbians face immense levels of hostility and danger despite not being directly addressed in the legislation. There is at least one plausible chance that this unforgivable law will be reversed in the near future, but only time will tell, time that our community there will never get back. Staying in the Caribbean now, and moving just one country to the north, we find Grenada. And while its story is not quite as grotesque and vile as Trinidad and Tobago's, it is still quite a horrible one, as even though the country gained independence back in 1974, by 1987, 13 years later, it decided to double down on hatred and pass its own, non-British, homegrown, anti-gay law that leads to homosexual men being imprisoned for 10 years. To this day, Grenada is one of the most dangerous locations in the Western Hemisphere to be LGBTQ, and there are currently no anti-discrimination laws in the country, which leads to lesbians and trans people facing extremely high levels of exclusion and persecution in their communities. While there are many calls for this self-imposed anti-gay law to be overturned, for now, Grenada is unwilling to let go of its bigotry, and while gay men are certainly the most harmed and directly impacted by the law, the social toxicity it continues to foster impacts every LGBTQ person unfortunate enough to have been born in this country. Continuing this very unfortunate journey now, we arrive back in Africa, where we find another country that decided to make being a gay man illegal all on its own. You see, Ghana gained its full independence back in 1957, but then, 3 years later in 1960, it passed Section 104 of the Ghanaian Criminal Code, making gay male relationships punishable with 3 years in prison. And if this was not bad enough, the government has been passing increasingly brutal anti-LGBTQ laws even as recently as last year. And currently, the country is in the process of making it a crime to identify as part of the community, which if fully implemented would essentially make being lesbian or trans a similar offense to the existing anti-gay law. The president of the country has directly called for every LGBTQ person in Ghana to be jailed for 3 years. A 2021 poll from Afrobarometer found that only 6.7% of respondents in Ghana would tolerate having a gay neighbor. And for the time being, the extreme crackdown on our people's existence seems to be genuinely popular in this radical Christian country, where religious extremism is flourishing at the moment. In a similar situation, we now head back to the Pacific Ocean, where Tonga has followed a very similar path to Ghana. In 1970, this island nation gained full independence, but then, 18 years later, it decided to make being a gay man a crime punishable with 10 years in prison and public flogging. And despite this law only applying directly to men, lesbians have suffered such extreme persecution that New Zealand has granted asylum to gay women. And there have been reports of lesbians being targeted by men and killed just for existing, highlighting how laws against one part of the community do quickly translate to attacks against the rest of us, as state-sponsored persecution normalizes violence and encourages anti-queer hostility across the board. And rather than focusing on making life safer for their LGBTQ citizens, Tonga has only doubled down on its small-minded bigotry, with a law from last year explicitly banning any attempts to ever legalize marriage equality in the future. For now, escaping to countries like New Zealand is seen by many queer people in Tonga as the only way to secure a free and safe life. Sadly, this situation is nearly identical to what we see in the neighboring country of Tuvalu. Back in 1978, Tuvalu became independent. But in 2018, 40 years after independence, the government then decided to criminalize the existence of gay men, with prison time ranging from between 5 and 10 years. In many ways, Tuvalu reflects almost everything we have just covered with Tonga, another radically Christian society that bases their laws and culture directly off of literal interpretations of the Bible. And as such, life for queer locals is essentially impossible, and most end up having to flee to more progressive countries in the area. Australia, in particular, has made this quite easy in recent years for climate change-related reasons, and this has become a lifeline to LGBTQ people born in Tuvalu who simply wish to live a normal life, without fear of law enforcement and societal condemnation. And that wraps up the third category of countries today, the countries that don't have an excuse and brought their horrible laws upon themselves. For anyone curious, some of the island nations we have covered are too small to show up visibly on this map. But before we end today's video, we have 3 final countries to cover that are in a category of their own, as they did not get their laws directly from the British Empire, or from the USSR, or from self-imposition, but rather from other smaller colonial powers. These are Eswatini, Papua New Guinea, and Samoa. In the case of Eswatini, the law that criminalizes gay male relationships is rooted in something quite complicated called Roman Dutch law, and was influenced by many colonial factors, including pressure from South Africa. Prison terms are decided by the court on a case-by-case basis for those convicted of being a gay male. Papua New Guinea had its anti-gay law enforced on them by Australia, with prison time ranging from 3 to 14 years today. And Samoa had theirs due to the colonial influences of New Zealand, with 5 years being the standard period of imprisonment. Now, if you are a student of history, you will notice that each of these 3 laws were rooted ultimately at their core in British colonialism, like the 5 countries we covered at the start of the video. But because Britain was not directly enforcing them, and other colonial powers had taken that role by this point, I thought it was slightly more accurate to give this section a category of its own. But now, after between 50 and 100 years of independence, these countries can no longer in good faith hide behind the evil legacy of colonization to justify their continued attacks on our community. At a certain point, human rights abuses need to be addressed by these long independent governments themselves. The fact that peoples who have been so oppressed gleefully do everything in their power to now oppress others is perhaps one of the saddest things about this world, and it really makes you think why these laws are still in place. In each of the 16 countries covered today, only gay men are explicitly criminalized, and yet, societies that accept this treatment of gay men are the exact societies in which the most rampant gender-based violence against women occurs, the exact same societies where trans people are treated like homosexuals and punished equally, and the exact same societies that lament the atrocities committed against them while actively committing atrocities against their own citizens to this day. And whether these primitive laws were inherited from colonial oppressors or passed by legitimate governments in the modern day, the result is the same: dangerous and unfree societies that play lip service to liberation as they work tirelessly to single out and persecute queer people and keep women disenfranchised in the name of patriarchy and religion. Two of the greatest diseases humanity has ever caught, and two that we must cure if we are ever to create the kind of world that you and I and everyone else deserves to live in. And on that note, thank you, friends, for watching and spending time today with me as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. Please consider liking this video and subscribing, as it really helps to please the algorithm gods. And if you really enjoy these videos and want to support me directly so I can keep making them on a routine basis, consider joining the Queer Kingdom officially here on YouTube by becoming a member of the channel. But just your presence here today means the world to me, so thank you for watching, for caring about our global community, and please always remember that good things do still happen even in dark times. Together, I know we can truly make the world a safer and freer place for us all. Until next time, QK out.